If you look at the global equity market at the moment, which has been rallying on the expectation that it thinks that things are going to get better in 2023, well, if we're right, things will get worse, not better. Corporate profits will decline globally. They won't be improving. And in those circumstances, particularly in the developed markets, equities would drop. There's a lot of uncertainty about how interest rates will evolve, as we just discussed, because it's so dependent on inflation, and inflation is hard to forecast.
Is this year a brighter year for China? And for those who have an eye on investing in China, are there any kind of significant risks that we should be taken into account? Well, let's come to Thailand. Thailand seems to have a brighter future here. We foresee, let's say, 30 million of tourists around the globe to be here in Thailand. Economy will be growing. How do you see Thailand this year? ปี 2022 นะครับถือเป็นปีที่มีความท้าทายเป็นอย่างยิ่งเลยนะครับสำหรับนักลงทุนเพราะว่ามีความไม่แน่นอนหลากหลายปัจจัยทางภูมิรัฐศาสตร์ก็ดีเรื่องของเงินเฟ้อก็ดีนะครับซึ่งทำให้ปีที่แล้วเป็นปีที่ท้าทายมากๆการลงทุนในแต่ละพื้นที่ถือได้ว่ายากต่อการคาดเดาเป็นอย่างยิ่งหลายฝ่ายตั้งคำถามนะครับว่าแล้วในปี 2023 นี่แหละครับจะเป็นปีที่ดีขึ้นกว่าปีที่แล้วหรือไม่นะครับเงินเฟ้อตอนนี้ผ่านจุดที่แย่ที่สุดไปแล้วหรือไม่คำว่า Recession หรือว่าเศรษฐกิจถดถอยนั้นเป็นอย่างไรครับในวันนี้เรามีแขกพิเศษที่จะมาพูดคุยกับเรานะครับท่านเป็น Chief Economist แล้วก็ Head of abrdn Research จาก abrdn นะครับคุณ Jeremy Lawson คุณ Jeremy Good morning
Thank you. Good morning to you.
Well, first of all, can I ask, people in the entire world anticipate the possibility of recession in 2023. What is your view as the head of abrdn Research Institute?
Yes, so we think a recession globally is the most likely scenario for 2023. The reason for that's relatively straightforward. Inflation is still too high, particularly core inflation, domestically generated inflation in a number of economies. Labour markets are very tight. And if you look historically, it's very, very difficult to bring economies back into balance without very tight monetary policy and contractions in economic activity. And so that's why we think it's the most likely scenario. Now, that doesn't mean that every economy in the world will go into recession into 2023, but most of the advanced economies, a number of emerging economies that are also in balance, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, the exception would be China, where they're recovering from zero COVID and will benefit from the reopening of the economy in 2023. There are some economies like Thailand, for example, that are benefiting from the rebound in global tourism activity, which is obviously very important for this country, but it's going to be a very difficult global year for the economy.
Yep. I've got a lot of questions from your answer when you talk about the possibility that, of course, it doesn't apply everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
But shall I focus on to the US, the largest economy in the world, as well as Europe?
Yeah.
Once we mention recession, there are several levels of recession. Strong recessions, mild recession, slow recession. How would you describe recession in the US and also European Union countries?
I think we would use the phrase moderate recession.
Moderate?
I don't like mild. Mild.
What are the difference between mild and moderate?
Yeah, so mild would be maybe think of it in the way that a lot of economists are forecasting recessions. If you look, there are very, very small increases in the unemployment rate. So maybe only about a percentage point in the United States, which would be the smallest increase in the unemployment rate in a recession in history. So it's really unusual, so very, very mild by historical standards. We think that the unemployment rate will double over the course of the next 18 months in the United States. So that's the type of recession that we envisage. Now, that wouldn't be as significant or as deep as the global financial crisis. It wouldn't be as deep as in 1973 after the oil shock. It wouldn't be as deep as the early 1980s, but more like the 1990s recession. So that's what we're expecting.
Yeah. ผมถามคุณเจอร์มี่ว่าปีนี้เนี่ยจะมี recession เศรษฐกิจถดถอยหรือเปล่าแกบอกว่ามันก็คงจะมีนะครับด้วยโมเมนตัมแต่ทั้งนี้ทั้งนั้นเนี่ยผมถามว่าแล้วมันจะไปลึกขนาดไหนเพราะว่า recession มันก็มี recession อย่างแรงนะฮะ recession อย่างเล็กน้อยท่านบอกแบบนี้แกไม่อยากใช้คำว่า mild recession หรือว่าถดถอยแบบอ่อนๆแต่อยากใช้คำว่า moderate recession มีความหมายแบบกลางๆหน่อย moderate recession.
Yeah.
And how about the EU? Because it seems to have suffered quite a lot, especially if we talk about the UK.
Yeah.
Especially when we talk about that inflation, which is high up there, over 10% already. So
Yeah.
what do you think about that, EU and the UK?
Yeah, so in the UK and the EU, inflation is going to come down quite significantly in 2023 because a lot of it was related to the energy price shock that occurred related to the war in Ukraine.
Oh, I see.
And energy prices, global oil prices, natural gas prices, even food prices are now significantly down from their peaks, and that will flow through into inflation numbers. But still, they won't escape recession either. The fact that commodity prices have moderated over the past few months probably means that the recession won't be as deep in Europe and the UK as it might otherwise have been, but it still will be a significant one.
Yeah. By the way, we can't analyze the global economy without thinking about inflation.
Yeah.
Inflation, if I understand correctly, it has been, better in the US in December. So how do you see inflation in 2023? By the way, have we been bottomed out?
Peaked. Yeah, we think that the worst of the inflation shock is in the past now.
Behind us already?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I mean, again, partly because energy prices and food prices increased so much last year that they would have to increase by the same amount just to keep inflation steady, and actually they've declined in outright terms. So inflation will fall through that channel. Global supply chains have also been improving. So think about that as the blockages in port activity, global transportation, the production of semiconductors, which had a big impact on the global auto sector in particular. These are weakening. You're already seeing car prices starting to drop. So that's feeding through into inflation. The component of inflation, though, that's going to be a lot stickier and is the part that central banks really have to be focused on is the domestically generated services inflation, the part that relates to wage developments. And whilst that's not quite as bad as it was, it's likely to come down only very slowly and require monetary policy to be tight.
Do you have any focus about inflation in the US? Because I think that in December it was 6.5, the CPI.
Yeah.
How is your focus in 2023?
Yeah, so in headline terms, inflation will sort of come down to somewhere around about 3% by the end of the year.
Still above the target. Still,
yeah, we still think that, but it's core inflation and underlying inflation that matters more to the central bank than headline, right? Because fluctuations in commodity prices, energy prices, food prices, the central bank doesn't think that they provide a lot of signals about more durable inflation. So they tend to ignore that and pay more attention to what's happening once you strip those components out. And that is the part, again, that's likely to come down more slowly.
ผมถามนะครับว่าเรื่องของตัวเงินเฟ้อเป็นยังไงแกบอกว่ามันผ่านจุดที่เลวร้ายที่สุดไปแล้วแหละแต่ว่ามันจะเป็น sticky inflation แปลว่ามันยังคงแฝงฝังอยู่นะครับในระบบเศรษฐกิจดังนั้นเนี่ยมันก็ยังคงทรงตัวอยู่ในระดับที่ค่อนข้างสูงนะครับแต่ว่าแต่ละพื้นที่เองก็จะมีเงินเฟ้อในอัตราที่ไม่เท่ากันซึ่งส่วนนี้เองครับก็จะส่งผลกระทบนะครับต่อเรื่องของท่าทีครับของบรรดาธนาคารกลางทั่วโลกด้วยว่าเขาจะมีท่าทีอย่างไรกันบ้างWhen we talk about inflation, we need to talk about the interest rate hikes, especially from Fed. I mean, it seems that they have decelerated already in that meeting, in the last meeting of FOMC recently. How do you see their movement, the interest rate hikes, dynamism in this year, 2023?
Yeah, so we think that they'll increase interest rates another 2 or 3 times this year. And that will sort of bring policy rates to close to 5%, which is high by recent standards. Again, that is aimed at tightening financial conditions and slowing the economy significantly. The Fed absolutely thinks that the unemployment rate needs to increase. Our view, though, is that once we get to around, if we're right that there's a recession, and that recession starts in the middle of the year, then we think that the Fed will start cutting interest rates into the second half of the year,
This year already?
Yes, particularly after September. But that's because we're forecasting a recession.
Okay.
And central banks always loosen monetary policy once proper recessions are underway. Inflation will be coming down more quickly at that point. And so that'll be telling the Fed that it needs to be loosening monetary policy, and that will continue into 2024. The big risk to that view is if the economy doesn't respond as much as the Fed thinks to the tightening it's already delivered, if inflation is even stickier than forecast, then the Fed might have to increase rates not just by more than it's guiding, but much more than the market is pricing in. And that obviously would be very difficult for the bond market to digest.
Jerome Powell mentioned several times about this term, soft landing.
Yes.
Do you think that they are able to manage that soft landing, and how soft will that be?
Well, if we thought that they could do that, we wouldn't be forecasting a recession, of course. So it's possible in the post-pandemic environment where lots of really unusual things have happened, and perhaps inflation comes down so rapidly and the labour market becomes much less tight without the unemployment rate having to increase. There are ways in which that could happen. What you really need to see, particularly in the labour market, is this very, very high ratio of job vacancies to job openings or vacancies to unemployment. That needs to drop, but without companies shedding labour. It needs to occur without corporate profits declining. So it's possible, we just don't think it's likely.
Oh, possible but not likely.
Yes.
Well, are there any kind of uncertainty that you might think that the investor need to be aware? For example, of course, geopolitics hasn't been over yet.
Yeah.
Not only Ukraine and Russia, but also the conflict, US, China, and Taiwan.
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, there are lots of potential sources of uncertainty in the global economy. So the war in Ukraine is a good example of that. And that creates both upside and downside risks. To the upside, well, if the war in Ukraine ended this year, then that would obviously be seen as a positive thing from a global risk sentiment perspective. We don't think that's likely, but again, it's possible. Alternatively, that war could get worse, right? Putin could escalate the attacks on Ukraine, particularly through unconventional weapons, and that might then mean that even greater sanctions had to be applied to Russia. So that's one thing that we have to worry about. US-China relations are always sort of complicated. We're not that far from going into the period in the run-up to the 2024 US presidential election. So you can expect politicking around that. More fundamentally, though, the US has been putting in place a number of pieces of legislation which are designed to make it more difficult for Chinese firms to export into the United States and participate in the growth of its industries. So that's the second one. Recessions itself, as I said, recessions aren't priced into markets. If you look at the global equity market at the moment, which has been rallying on the expectation that it thinks that things are going to get better in 2023, well, if we're right, things will get worse, not better. Corporate profits will decline globally. They won't be improving. And in those circumstances, particularly in the developed markets, equities would drop. There's a lot of uncertainty about how interest rates will evolve, as we just discussed, because it's so dependent on inflation, and inflation is hard to forecast. So I think there's lots of pitfalls for investors in 2023.
ทีนี้ถามว่าแล้วในการประชุมครั้งต่อๆไปนะครับของ FOMC หรือว่าคณะกรรมการทางการเงินนะครับของสหรัฐนี้เนี่ยปีนี้เขาจะเดินหน้าขึ้นดอกเบี้ยอย่างไรซึ่งท่านก็บอกนะครับบอกว่าก็คงจะต้องมีการเดินหน้าขึ้นไปนะครับในช่วงของต้นปีจนถึงกลางปีมีแนวโน้มนะครับว่าอาจจะเห็นทิศทางการกลับทิศกันด้วยก็คือการที่จะค่อยๆปรับดอกเบี้ยลงผมถามว่ามันเป็นไปได้หรือที่จะมีการกลับทิศนโยบายท่านบอกเป็นไปได้ครับถ้าหากว่าทางabrdnเนี่ยมีความเชื่อว่าปีนี้จะมีเศรษฐกิจถดถอยดังนั้นนโยบายการเงินที่ผ่อนคลายมากขึ้นจากทางเฟดและธนาคารกลางจึงเป็นสิ่งที่มีความจำเป็นด้วยเช่นเดียวกันครับWell, I might ask you about your recommended investing strategies in the end. But can China, which have already relaxed their COVID-19 controlling measures, become a good compensation for the recession in the world in Western Hemisphere?
I don't think compensation is the right way to describe it. So let me explain. Reopening will lead to stronger growth in China. There's no doubt about that. The current
Do you
period,
see the risk at the opening stage of the reopening?
So in the first few months, things are going to be very bumpy just because of the number of cases, the health consequences, particularly in rural areas. So we saw a very, Q4 economic activity in China is likely to be very weak. It'll probably be stronger in the first quarter. But as we go through 2023, there's a lot of pent-up demand that's been suppressed by the zero COVID strategy, particularly last year. The property sector still has a lot of adjustments that it needs to make. But again, the worst of the downturn in the Chinese property sector is now probably behind us. The government looks like it's taking some of the pressure off of domestic technology firms, so that's another sort of positive impulse. So the Chinese economy is going to improve, but for the rest of the world, it's more complicated. One of the things that we're concerned about is if Chinese demand picks up a lot. Remember, we've got an inflation problem around the world because demand is very high relative to supply, relative to capacity. So if you have a new source of demand coming into the global economy, that will tend to be inflationary at the margin. And because it's inflationary, so think about the way, for example, that commodity prices have started to pick up again, particularly industrial commodities. Iron ore prices have increased by 50% since China sort of announced that it was sort of reopening. So these things sort of add to inflation pressures at a time when other central banks are trying to contain them. It makes that job more difficult. So unless China's reopening was to boost the supply side of the global economy more than the demand side of the economy, which we don't think is likely, then it's a very mixed bag for the rest of the world. Now again, Thailand's a good example of somewhere where it's probably a net benefit. Thailand was one of the places that was affected most by the pandemic because of the effect on the tourism sector. That is now coming back very sort of strongly. You sort of have to think country by country, but from a global perspective, it's mixed.
ทางด้านของคุณเจอร์มี่ก็ได้บอกนะครับว่าถ้าเกิดว่าเศรษฐกิจจีนมีการเปิดขึ้นมาแน่นอนนะครับว่ามันเป็นผลบวกครับแต่ปัญหาของมันก็คือว่ามันอาจจะทำให้ดีมานด์ครับหรือว่าอุปสงค์ของสินค้าและบริการของโลกใบนี้เนี่ยเยอะมากขึ้นเมื่อมันเยอะมากขึ้นก็มีความหมายนะครับว่าถ้าซัพพลายมันยังไม่พร้อมก็จะดันให้เป็นปัจจัยเสริมนะครับเป็นการไปซ้ำเติมสภาวะเงินเฟ้อเศรษฐกิจแต่ละประเทศอาจจะมีเอกลักษณ์ของตัวเองพัฒนาไปได้แต่ต้องไม่ลืมนะครับว่าโลกทั้งใบนั้นมีความเชื่อมโยงกันด้วยซึ่งในส่วนนี้ก็ต้องมองนะครับว่าการเปิดของจีนเองก็อาจจะส่งผลกระทบต่อเศรษฐกิจของประเทศอื่นเช่นเดียวกัน Once we talk about China the reopening and the demand and I said that it will be huge demand of energy oil and so on do you do any kind of focus about the oil price in 2023
So when you're thinking about oil prices, again, think about there being two competing forces. On the one hand, you have, as you say, you've got Chinese reopening. Chinese people have done a lot less travel, whether it's to work, whether it's domestic holidays, whether it's foreign holidays. And so reopening puts upward pressure on global demand. However, recessions in a lot of the rest of the world will be dampening for demand. Right? Now, we think that the rest of the world effect will be stronger than the China effect. So we think that oil prices will probably drop through the year rather than increase. But it depends. If the China effect ends up being stronger or if the rest of the world doesn't go into recession, then oil prices would likely increase in those circumstances. So it just depends a lot on this sort of relativity between demand in the rest of the world as it slows and demand in China as it picks up.
ผมถามนะครับว่าแล้วราคาน้ำมันเนี่ยจะเป็นไงบ้างท่านก็บอกแบบนี้นะครับบอกว่าถึงแม้ว่าจีนจะเปิดขึ้นมานะครับความต้องการพลังงานโดยเฉพาะยิ่งเนี่ยน้ำมันเยอะขึ้นแน่นอนแต่ต้องไม่ลืมนะครับว่าอีกซีกโลกหนึ่งนะครับจะเกิดปัญหาก็คือเรื่องเศรษฐกิจถดถอยดังนั้นราคาน้ำมันจะเป็นอย่างไรต้องมาดูแล้วครับว่าตัวแปรสองตัวนี้จะมีปฏิสัมพันธ์อย่างไรกันบ้างครับ Well I can't leave China without talking about one of the key threat in Chinese economy the debt and the default in real estate sector. I mean, how far do you think that they have been progressing in solving that problem which lie beneath the carpet in China?
Yeah, look, I don't think the problem isn't solved. There's still a lot of excess debts in part of the property sector. There's a lot of excess supply as well, overbuilding that's taking place over many years. That will take a number of years to work off. So we shouldn't ever expect Chinese property sector growth to be as strong as it was in the past.
Okay.
So it's going to become less important within the context of the Chinese economy.
Now they represent 1/4 of the total economy.
If you think about all of the, right, so the narrow real estate investment isn't a quarter of the economy, but if you think about all the types of activity that are connected to it, yes, it's very, very large. And there's no real way to rotate away from that driver of activity and that excess investment without it weighing on growth over a long period of time. So that's one of the things that puts a ceiling on Chinese growth. Now, I don't think that means that we should expect a debt crisis in China. If you look at the property developers in particular, they don't account for a large enough share of total lending. The Chinese authorities have ways in which they can recapitalize any banks or lenders that were excessively reliant on that type of activity. But again, countries that are over-levered, that tends to constrain growth over longer periods of time. So this is one of the reasons why once we get through the COVID rebound itself, we think that Chinese growth is more likely to settle between 4% and 5% in the long term, which is obviously it's lower than it was in the past, a lot lower, but equally higher than most other countries in the world experience.
Now, will this be a time bomb, the debt and the default in real estate, or will it be only a ceiling?
I think it's more of a ceiling. So China's advantaged by, again, the fact that so if you were to look at actually even Thailand in the 1990s, so everybody remembers, well, not everybody, but the Asian crisis in the 1990s, which had a really big impact on a number of countries in the region. But a lot of the problem was foreign debt. Is that a lot of the investment in the real estate sector or the types of activity that were booming was coming from overseas. So a lot of capital had flowed in, and then as the economy sort of weakened, as these debts went bad, that foreign money sort of fled quite quickly. You had exchange rate crises, those sorts of things. China doesn't run a current account deficit, right? It is still a domestically financed economy primarily. So that means that it's much more difficult for foreign capital to have that type of effect. So it's like almost sort of think about it as a balloon. Right? In countries that have got debt imbalances, but that they're foreign debt imbalances, when things go wrong, the balloon pops, right? Things go bad very quickly, boom to bust. In countries like China, which is a bit more like Japan in the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s, it's just like letting the air out of the balloons slowly.
Gradually.
Right, exactly. So it still has to deflate, it just doesn't go out with a bang.
Good comparison. ผมถามเรื่องอสังหาริมทรัพย์นะก็บอกว่าคุยเศรษฐกิจจีนแล้วไม่คุยเรื่องนี้คงไม่ได้นะครับแกบอกว่าแน่นอนว่ามันยังไม่ได้รับการแก้ไขนะครับแต่ว่ามันก็คงจะเป็นเพดานในการที่จะควบคุมทำให้เศรษฐกิจจีนเนี่ยไม่เติบโตอย่างที่หลายคนคาดหวังกันเอาไว้นะครับแกบอกแบบนี้อย่าไปนึกถึงภาพนะครับของวิกฤตอสังหาเอเชียหรือวิกฤตเศรษฐกิจเอเชียในช่วงทศวรรษที่ 90 ซึ่งตอนนั้นมันมีปัจจัยก็คือเรื่องของเงินทุนไหลเข้ามากำไรเรื่องของการเข้ามาแล้วเนี่ยเรามีการกู้เงินต่างประเทศมันมีสหสัมพันธ์ระหว่างตัวเศรษฐกิจภายในประเทศในเอเชียกับต่างประเทศแต่ว่าของจีนแตกต่างกันครับแกบอกว่ามันจะไม่ได้มีลักษณะว่าเป็นฟองสบู่ใหญ่ๆขึ้นมาแล้วแตกโป๊ะแต่จะเหมือนกับลูกโป่งครับที่ค่อยๆปล่อยลมออกทีละน้อยเพราะฉะนั้นมันคงไม่ได้อันตรายน่ากลัวเหมือนที่หลายฝ่ายคิดเอาไว้ด้วยนะครับ By the way, Xi Jinping has extended his term into the third term. People is afraid of common prosperity. Some people is afraid of regulatory risks that what I have to say is make a lot of technology company in China collapsing. How would you foresee the political influence in China in relation to economic growth this year?
Yeah, look, I think in the last few months, the emphasis of the government has switched to focus more on the economy because it has been so weak in the last couple of years. So if you look at Chinese activity relative to its pre-pandemic trend, it's now had sort of one of the larger negative impacts. And so I think one of the reasons why they relaxed the zero COVID strategy, but also while you're starting to see some of the constraints on Chinese property developers or financial conditions for them starting to loosen, you've seen some of the pressure on technology companies weaken, which is one of the reasons why some of those have had some of the largest share price gains in the market in the last few months. So that emphasis on the economy has increased, but common prosperity isn't going away. I mean, I think she is not unreasonably recognises that over the longer term, there needs to be more of a focus on environmental, objectives. The previous trajectory wasn't sustainable over the longer term. Similarly, social stability is something that he's long believed in, and so there'll always be elements of that. There are any particular sectors of the economy that are growing too quickly or in an unbalanced ways or inconsistent with the broader social objectives in China, then they will face some degree of regulatory scrutiny. So in that sense, regulatory risk hasn't disappeared, but it's probably not as intense as it was in 2021 and early 2022. But foreign investors, I think, they'll need to see the administration maintain that more balanced stance for a longer period of time, because it's only the passage of time that sort of makes people feel confident that it might not happen again.
ผมถามนะครับว่าแล้วปัจจัยทางด้านของการเมืองนะครับเพราะว่าสีจิ้นผิงมีการต่ออายุตนเองเป็นประธานาธิบดีสมัยที่3แล้วนะครับแกก็บอกแบบนี้ครับบอกว่าในประเด็นเรื่องของ common prosperity หรือว่ารุ่งเรืองร่วมกันคงไม่ได้หายไปไหนเรื่องของการปรับเปลี่ยนกฎกติกาเพื่อให้สังคมมีความสมดุลมากขึ้นก็เป็นความเชื่อที่สีจิ้นผิงเชื่อมาเป็นเวลายาวนานเนี่ยคงจะยังอยู่นะครับแต่ต้องยอมรับอย่างว่าในช่วงหลายเดือนที่ผ่านมาครับจีนเองประกาศชัดเจนว่าต้องการโฟกัสในเรื่องการเติมเต็มเศรษฐกิจให้มีการเติบโตมากขึ้นเพราะต้องยอมรับว่ามีความอ่อนแอไปเยอะพอสมควรแต่ยังไงก็ตามครับในมิติของการเดินหน้าอย่างมีความสมดุลเป็นความสำคัญต่อพวกเขาอยู่เยอะพอสมควรอยู่ด้วยนะครับ Well by the way is this year a brighter year for China and for those who have an eye on investing in China are there any kind of significant risks that we should be taken into account
Yeah, so look, our view is that it will be a brighter year for China.
How brighter?
Well, it's hard to forecast exactly how bright, but as I said, economic growth is going to pick up significantly. As growth improves, well, that will be good for the corporate sector in China, right? So those negative trends that I talked about elsewhere in corporates, the reverse ought to be true. Maybe another way to think about it is China was more or less in recession last year, right? It wasn't called a recession because the Chinese economy rarely contracts outright, but relative to its potential, it was sort of operating, with a lot of spare capacity. And so sort of almost sort of think about China and the United States as like ships passing in the night, right? Like that. And so from a market perspective, we think that 2023 for Chinese securities should be a lot better, even though the market has already picked up from the trough. It still hasn't regained anywhere near like its previous levels. Our equity analysts still think that the market offers sort of good value at current levels. Now, trying to forecast whether it's a 10% gain from here or a 20% gain, that's very difficult to do. And there are other global headwinds, of course, but the strongest signal is that Chinese markets should outperform the US and other developed markets in 2023.
That's really clear. นะครับผมถามแกบอกว่าแล้วปีนี้เป็นปีที่เราควรจะมี position บวกกับจีนหรือเปล่าท่านบอกแบบนี้ครับบอกว่ามันเป็นปีที่สดใสกว่าแน่นอนแต่ตอบไม่ได้นะครับว่าจะสดใสขนาดไหนเพราะปีที่ผ่านมาต้องยอมรับว่าลำบากไปพอสมควรปีนี้เนี่ยคงตอบไม่ได้ว่าแล้วมันจะดีขึ้นอย่างไรแต่ที่แน่นอนชัดเจนที่สุดครับคือคงจะต้องดีกว่าหลายๆตลาดเพราะปัจจัยเอื้อเนี่ยมีค่อนข้างเยอะ Well are there any kind of risks that we need to take into account? For example, geopolitics, the competition between U.S. and China.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we've already talked about some of these things, and look, they're real. And we can't. First of all, we can't be certain what the path out of COVID is going to be. Right? So it could be that has a more persistent negative effect on the economy through the health channel in particular. So that's one possibility. Second is that the deterioration in growth in the rest of the world might have more of a chilling effect on growth in China.
Okay.
Right? So that's sort of possible. As you said, geopolitics is I think one of the larger risks. The decoupling that's been taking place between the United States and China, it's sort of been happening slowly rather than rapidly. But if there were to be tensions around the South China Sea, or over trade policy more generally, or maybe China is sort of drawn more into, it's harder to avoid being drawn into Russia's problems and the war in Ukraine. All of these represent risks, so you have to pay very close attention to those in case they're worse than you think.
ผมถามว่าความเสี่ยงมีไหมแกก็บอกว่าความเสี่ยงแน่นอนแหละครับมันก็มีหลายปัจจัยด้วยกันนะครับแต่ต้องไม่ลืมนะครับว่าเศรษฐกิจทั่วโลกตอนนี้เชื่อมโยงกันเป็นเหมือนแผ่นเดียวกันนะครับจีนเติบโตแต่ถ้าเกิดว่าเศรษฐกิจทั่วโลกนะครับเกิดว่าหดตัวลงคือ recession แล้วที่สุดก็ส่งผลกระทบต่อจีนนอกเหนือไปจากนี้ยังมีเรื่องของปัจจัยต่างๆนะครับเรื่องของภูมิรัฐศาสตร์ไม่ว่าจะเป็นทางด้านของจีนเองในพื้นที่เช่นทะเลจีนใต้แบบนี้หรือแม้กระทั่งการที่จีนเองเนี่ยหลายครั้งเนี่ยถูกเหมารวมว่าเป็นส่วนหนึ่งนะครับของความขัดแย้งรัสเซียยูเครนสิ่งเหล่านี้คือสิ่งที่เราก็คงจะต้องมองโลกแบบกว้างๆไม่สามารถที่จะปิดส่วนใดส่วนหนึ่งได้ Well, let's move to emerging markets. In the past year, I think when we look at the performance of emerging markets, I mean, Thailand is one of that.
Yeah.
It seems that we have not done badly. We have done quite well in comparison to other markets. How do you see the performance of emerging markets in 2023?
Yeah, I think it's important when it comes to emerging markets to remember that each has its own idiosyncratic drivers.
Okay.
Okay? So sometimes, particularly over short periods, the markets move together because they're considered a single asset class, and that then means that capital can flow in a particular direction. But I think it is important to differentiate between the drivers. So I'll give you an example. In Central and Eastern Europe, that's part of the world with some of the biggest inflation problems at the moment, right? Where underlying inflation is so far above central bank targets that it's going to be extremely difficult for them to escape the recessions that are going to happen in Europe and the advanced economies, right? So that's going to be very challenging. Whereas, as you said, use Thailand as an example. Thailand is an economy where a lot of the headwinds that have been facing it will ease in 2023. Although we have to remember that Thailand also has a significant manufacturing sector, and a lot of those manufactured goods are for export to the rest of the world and to the United States and Europe and places like that, and that demand might weaken. So even within emerging economies, some sectors will do better and some will do worse. We like emerging market local currency bonds, but on a currency hedged basis. So what that means is we don't want to take the currency risk, and the main reason we don't want to take the currency risk is because we think that there's a decent chance that if things go badly in the United States, then the US dollar will appreciate again. So a big tailwind in emerging economy assets in the last few months has been the fact that the dollar's been depreciating, right? And it hasn't just been for one nearly all emerging market currencies have appreciated against the dollar over that period. But that's just really a function of the fact that risk sentiment's been improving. So if global risk sentiment weakens again, right, what you want to do is be able to benefit from appreciation in bonds, but again, not taking the currency risk because those currencies could sort of suffer. So it's a very nuanced picture when thinking about emerging markets and who does well and who does poorly.
ผมถามเรื่องของตลาดเกิดใหม่นะครับ emerging markets ครับแกก็บอกว่าท้าทายนะครับเพราะว่าคำว่าตลาดเกิดใหม่มันมีหลายตลาดมันมีหลายภูมิภาคด้วยกันนะครับแกยกตัวอย่างเช่นถ้าเกิดไปดูยุโรปตะวันออกแบบนี้เป็นต้น ก็จะเป็นตลาดที่มีเงินเฟ้อสูงมากนะครับแล้วก็มีความท้าทายเพราะฉะนั้นมีความเสี่ยงต่อ recession เยอะมากแต่ถ้าเกิดเรามาดูที่บ้านเราก็อาจจะแตกต่างออกไปด้วยนะครับแต่ว่าถ้าเกิดว่ายังไงก็ตามถ้าเราดูเนี่ยเรื่องการลงทุนในบอนด์นะครับหรือว่าพันธบัตรนะครับซึ่งเป็นสกุลเงินท้องถิ่นย้ำแบบนี้แต่จะต้องเป็นสกุลเงินท้องถิ่นที่ถูก hedge ไปแล้วด้วยนะครับซึ่งตรงนี้แกบอกว่าถ้าเกิดว่าเราไปมีความไปสุ่มเสี่ยงกับเรื่องของความเสี่ยงเรื่องอัตราแลกเปลี่ยนซึ่งต้องบอกยากต่อการคาดเดานะครับอย่างเช่นปีที่แล้วเนี่ยดอลลาร์แข็งท้ายปีก็พบว่าอ่อนค่าลงไปนะครับดังนั้นถ้าเกิดว่าเราจะโฟกัสไปที่ตรงนี้แล้วเราไปดูที่บอนด์นะครับขอให้ดูการพิจารณาการลงทุนเนี่ยที่อาจจะถอดปัจจัยเรื่องของความเสี่ยงของตัวอัตราแลกเปลี่ยนไปแล้วด้วยอันนั้นน่าจะเป็นหนึ่งในสิ่งที่น่าจะพิจารณาด้วย Once you talk about the dollar appreciation and depreciation last year how do you think about and the focus on US dollar index this year 2023
Yeah, so there are two competing forces, I think, influencing the dollar. Recently, to think about it maybe as relative interest rates and risk sentiment, and where that risk sentiment is heavily influenced by global growth dynamics. In the last months of 2022 and early 2023, the dollar's been depreciating. And the reason is because both of those drivers were working against the dollar. Risk sentiment was improving and interest rates have been declining. Right? And so we shouldn't be surprised that the dollar depreciated over that period. In 2023, while those relative interest rates will probably decline through the year, if we're in a recessionary environment, the risk sentiment channel is likely to go back to being a headwind. So the dollar often appreciates during global recessions because it's seen as a safe haven. We don't think that it'll appreciate too much, but I don't think that the depreciation, the drops in the dollar we've seen of late will continue in recessionary circumstances.
ผมถามว่าเราคุยกันค่อนข้างเยอะนะครับแล้วเรื่องของการแข็งค่าการอ่อนค่าเงิน US ดอลลาร์จะเป็นยังไงในปีนี้ 2023เขาบอกแบบนี้เขาบอกว่าต้องให้ไปดูนะครับว่ามี2ปัจจัยที่ขับเคลื่อน US ดอลลาร์อยู่1ก็คือเรื่องทิศทางดอกเบี้ยของทางเฟดอีกส่วนนึงก็คือปัจจัย sentiment ของทั่วโลกเลยนะครับที่มีต่อตัวเศรษฐกิจซึ่งปีนี้อาจจะเป็น recession มันขึ้นอยู่กับปฏิสัมพันธ์ของแรงกระทำ2ตัวนี้ว่าจะออกมายังไงก็ตามปีนี้ชัดเจนนะครับว่าทิศทางอัตราดอกเบี้ยคงจะไม่ดุดันเหมือนกันกับปีที่แล้วอาจจะมีแนวโน้มลงแต่มันก็มีปัจจัยอื่นทีนี้ก็จะต้องมาดูแล้วครับว่าถึงแม้ว่าเป็นไปได้ว่าดอลลาร์นั้นอาจจะอ่อนค่าลงแต่ไม่ได้มีความหมายว่าจะอ่อนค่าหัวภาพมากมายสักเท่าไหร่นั่นก็เป็นภาพส่วนหนึ่งนะครับที่ให้กับทางของ US ดอลลาร์ Well, let's come to Thailand. Thailand seems to have a brighter future here. We foresee, let's say, 30 million of tourists around the globe to be here in Thailand. Economy will be growing. How do you see Thailand this year?
Yeah, as you said, that tourism impulse has the potential to be very, very important. Taiwan, tourism is an export. That's the way that it's recorded in national accounts, and Thailand has one of the largest net tourism export patterns in the world. Right, that's how important tourism is to the Thai economy. So yes, that's likely to lead to stronger growth in 2023. Where the Thai government and central bank have to be careful is that impulse could be so strong. So think about, as all those tourists come in, what's going to happen to hotel prices, what's going to happen to restaurant prices, what's going to happen to all the recreational activities that happen that are associated with that. Well, it's probably going to put upward pressure on prices, upward pressure on inflation. And so they have to be careful that tourism boom doesn't translate into an inflation boom. So fiscal policy will need to be disciplined. Monetary policy, which has already started to tighten from a very low level, right? Interest rates in Thailand have been very low, but they're going to have to start to rise. The good news is that in Thailand, underlying inflation, core inflation, so when you strip out food and energy, that's sort of relatively subdued. It's only a little bit above the central bank's target. But if the economy is too strong, then that will cause problems in the future. So the government, the central bank, are going to have to make sure that as growth improves, if there are signs that wage growth picks up and inflation growth pick up, then it's going to have to tighten monetary policy and fiscal policy to offset it.
ถามถึงเรื่องเศรษฐกิจไทยนะครับท่านบอกว่าก็ชัดเจนแล้วครับว่าเรื่องของเศรษฐกิจไทยนั้นเรามีส่วนใหญ่ๆเลยก็คือส่วนของการท่องเที่ยวก็คือเป็นเอ็กซ์พอร์ตประเภทหนึ่งคือไปเอาเงินจากคนต่างชาติเข้ามานั่นเองนะครับเศรษฐกิจไทยดูดีครับแต่ถ้าเกิดว่าการท่องเที่ยวกลับมามีความหมายนะครับว่าราคาโรงแรมก็ดีราคาร้านอาหารก็ดีราคาแรงงานก็ดีอาจจะมีการปรับตัวขึ้นดังนั้นเนี่ยการยังบอกว่าข้อห่วงกังวลสำหรับเศรษฐกิจไทยครับถ้าเกิดว่าเศรษฐกิจดีขึ้นอาจจะนำไปสู่เงินเฟ้อที่สูงมากขึ้นดังนั้นเรื่องของนโยบายการเงินซึ่งตอนนี้เริ่มต้นมีการใช้นโยบายการเงินที่เข้มงวดมากขึ้นกว่าแต่เดิมนะครับจำเป็นต้องโฟกัสอีกส่วนหนึ่งครับก็คือวินัยทางการคลังมีความจำเป็นอย่างยิ่งเพราะถ้าเกิดเศรษฐกิจโตและนำไปสู่อินเฟลชันหรือว่าเงินเฟ้อที่สูงขึ้นก็อาจจะกลายเป็นความท้าทายได้ It seems that 2023 will be at least more predictable from not quite predictable. No, could be brighter. I don't know. What should be the concerns and what should be the points in which the investors in Thailand should be focusing in investing? And it would be wonderful if you could give a perspective on different asset class as well.
Yeah. I'm very wary of talking about 2023 being a brighter year. Right? If there is a recession in half of the world's economies, it will not be a bright year. Markets are definitely not pricing in that outcome at the moment, right? And so the improvement in sentiment we've been seeing late will fall away very, very quickly. However, the grain of the market will be different. And so let me go through the ways. So, for example, last year was a very difficult year for the Chinese equity market, particularly up until about October, November, and even December. Whereas 2023 should be a better year for China than for developed market equities. The bond market is likely to be very different in 2023. So last year, the big theme was monetary policy tightening across the world and concerns about rising inflation. Well, inflation's on a downward trajectory. It's an open question about how quickly, but it is. Investors that might have been seeking inflation protection are less likely to need that in 2023, at least from a short-term perspective. So the bond market has got the potential to perform quite well in 2023, at least if inflation continues to come down. So you might remember last year a 60-40 portfolio did terribly because bonds sold off and equities sold off. Well, in 2023, the bond component should do much better. It's the equity component, but even there, some markets will do better than others. In a recessionary environment, a lot of the focus in investing has to be on quality companies and being very selective stock picking. You want recession resilient firms. You want firms with strong balance sheets, with good corporate governance, the ability to navigate difficult circumstances well. Because the last 2 years has been dominated first by the boom in growth assets, and then a rotation into value, particularly into things like energy, but not just energy, financials. I think 2023 is going to be much more of a year about sort of quality firms in both corporate debt and in equities. And then, of course, there'll be other opportunities. Multi-asset portfolios have opportunities to navigate these complex environments in a more nuanced way. There are liquid alternative investments that are available that can sometimes be uncorrelated or less correlated with economic cycles. So they're sort of the types of things. You want diversification in portfolios. You want currency positions that, again, are attuned to choppy markets. I think maybe one of the big themes this year will be the rotation from dollar exposures to yen portfolio exposures, because the yen acts as a proxy for global bond yields. So these are some of the things to consider.
Many factors were so valuable. ผมบอกนะครับว่าปี 2023 จะดูสว่างท้าทายก็แม่ก็บอกว่าคงไม่พูดแบบนั้นเพราะว่าแต่ละ economy แต่ละปัจจัยก็แตกต่างกันเช่นกันบอกว่าจีนนะครับในแง่ของตลาดหุ้นเองก็อาจจะดูดีเพราะปีที่แล้วมันดูแย่จูบจนกระทั่งเดือนกันยายนตุลาคมก็ค่อยๆกลับมาดีขึ้นในขณะเดียวกันถ้าเกิดว่ามาดูตลาดอื่นๆเองนะครับก็แน่นอนว่าอัตราดอกเบี้ยขาขึ้นในปีที่แล้วกับสภาวะในปีนี้แตกต่างกันครับเพราะฉะนั้นเนี่ยการที่จะลงทุนสลับระหว่างบอนด์กับ Equity ก็เลยอาจจะมีสัดส่วนของปีแล้วกับปีนี้แตกต่างกันนะครับสำหรับปีนี้เองแกบอกว่าเป็นปีที่ถ้าเกิดบอกว่าให้บอกสักหนึ่งคำสำคัญมากๆนะครับก็คือการที่เราไปเลือกนะครับถ้าเราไปเลือกลงในหุ้นต้องเลือกหุ้นที่มีคุณภาพนะครับเพราะหุ้นที่มีคุณภาพไปดูว่าสถานภาพทางการเงินเขาเป็นอย่างไรเขามีความสามารถในการที่จะรับแรงกระแทกจาก Recession ได้มากน้อยขนาดไหนคงจะต้องใช้ความรู้ในการที่จะไปดูว่าบริษัทใดมีธรรมาภิบาลอย่างไรสามารถที่จะเดินหน้าท่ามกลางบรรยากาศนะครับที่อาจจะทะเลนั้นอาจจะยังมีคลื่นลมอยู่นั้นได้อย่างไรกันบ้างอีกส่วนหนึ่งครับปีที่แล้วเนี่ยคนอาจจะไปมองในเรื่องของ US ดอลลาร์ที่มีการแข่งค่าขึ้นปีนี้อาจจะต้องกลับทิศมาดูสักนิดนะครับว่าทิศทางของเยนนั้นจะเป็นอย่างไรเพราะว่าเยนเองก็ถือได้ว่าเป็นสกุลเงินนะครับที่มีความสำคัญต่อตลาดบอนด์เยอะพอสมควรนะครับอย่างไรก็ตามครับปีนี้เป็นปีที่ท้าทายแต่ท่านก็ให้หลักคิดมาค่อนข้างเยอะ Well I think the last 45 minutes has been so valuable. I mean, you provide a lot of the framework for the investors in order to think about what they should land their investment in 2023. Thank you very much for having joining us. Thank you very much, Mr. Lawson. Thank you.
Thank you.
ฝากกดติดตามกดไลค์กด Subscribe กดกระดิ่งช่วยเตือนไม่ให้พลาดทุกข่าวสารดีๆจาก The Standard World กันนะครับ